History records not only the glory of kings, their triumphs on the battlefield and the golden days they brought to their people, but also their deepest tragedies. Some rulers' names are remembered with pride for centuries, while others become forever bound to a cursed tale. And the story we tell today does not focus on shining palaces, golden thrones, or the might of armies. It turns instead to something far darker, far more unsettling, the story of a king who rotted alive. Imagine this. In the heart of Europe, a king once seen by his people as a semi-divine figure suddenly begins to notice a stench rising from his own body. At first, it is nothing more than small wounds. Then come festering sores oozing with pus, and before long, an odor so unbearable it surrounds him wherever he goes. For an ordinary man, this would already be a nightmare beyond imagination. But for a king, it was not only physical torment, it was also a political and spiritual catastrophe. For the people did not see their sovereign's sickness as a mere medical affliction, but as a sign of God's wrath. Today, I will take you into the cursed life of this king. We will uncover who he was, the world he ruled, how his illness progressed, and how it ultimately became a tragedy that consumed not only his body, but also his crown. As you listen to this story, you will witness more than just the decay of flesh. You will witness the decay of faith, of power, and of an empire itself. When the king first ascended the throne, his name echoed with power. To his people, he was not merely a ruler, he was God's representative on earth, the guardian of justice and order. The palace halls, adorned with gold, bore witness to feasts of triumph. His very presence gave his subjects confidence and struck fear into his enemies. Yet history has always shown us one truth. Even the mightiest bodies eventually collapse at their weakest point. At first, this collapse was silent. The king felt as strong as ever. He still went on hunts, still held lavish banquets in his palace. But one day, a small wound appeared on his skin. Harmless at first glance, it should have closed within a few days. But it did not. Instead, as the days passed, it began to grow. No one paid much attention in the beginning, for kings too had mortal bodies. Minor cuts and scratches were nothing unusual. But this wound was different. It darkened to a deep red, and soon the skin around it turned black. Physicians were summoned in haste. The wisest healers of the court applied ointments made from herbs, prescribed hot baths, whispered prayers. Yet the wound did not heal. It grew larger, deeper. Pus began to flow, and with it came a stench that filled the royal chambers. At first, the odor was disguised. Servants filled his rooms with incense, burned heavy scented oils. But soon these efforts proved useless. The disease advanced, and with it, the smell grew unbearable. Even those closest to him struggled to remain by his side. Some covered their noses as they served him, while others found excuses to avoid entering his chambers at all. This was not only a matter of health, it was a crisis of authority. For a king was meant to embody perfection in the eyes of his people. The visible rot of his flesh shattered this sacred image. Courtiers worked desperately to keep the truth from spreading beyond the palace walls. But rumors slipped through, carried swiftly among the people. God has cursed the king. Calamity will soon strike the realm. His rotting flesh is punishment for his sins. Such whispers echoed through villages and marketplaces. For the medieval mind, such afflictions were never merely natural. They were divine omens. To them, the king's decay was not a medical misfortune, but a message from heaven itself. The king's spirit faltered under these whispers. At first, he had tried to hide his illness with pride. But soon there was no disguising it. He could no longer bear to look at himself in the palace mirrors. He avoided the eyes of those around him. Pain increased each day, new sores blossoming across his body. His skin turned black in places, tearing apart at the slightest touch. The healers were powerless. Some tried bloodletting, the most common treatment of the age, but it only weakened him further. Others brewed potions from exotic plants brought from distant lands. Nothing worked. The wounds refused to close. They spread faster. Fear and disgust seeped into the palace. Servants hesitated to enter his chamber. Nobles averted their gaze when brought before him. Some muttered prayers at the sight of his decaying flesh. Others whispered that the throne itself would soon crumble. But none suffered more than the king himself. The man who once rode at the head of glittering armies now lay writhing in his bed, consumed alive by a merciless disease. His torment was not only of the body, it was of the soul. Each day he felt not only his flesh rotting away, but also his honor, his authority, his very humanity. And so began the tale of the curse, a journey that started with a single wound and grew into a tragedy that would reshape the fate of a kingdom. When the king's decay could no longer be concealed, the whispers slipped beyond the palace walls and began to echo through the streets of the city. What had first spread as hushed rumors soon became the central subject of conversation among peasants and merchants alike. Everyone was speaking of the same thing. The king's body was rotting while he still lived. For the medieval mind, such an affliction could not be explained naturally. Medicine at the time was painfully limited. Disease was not understood in terms of germs or bacteria, but as divine punishment or demonic curse. And so the people began to see the king's illness as nothing less than the mighty wrath of God. The teachings of the church only reinforced this. A king was believed to be chosen by God himself, so if his flesh was decaying, it could only mean that God had abandoned him, condemning his sins with a living death. In city squares and on church steps, voices whispered, "God does not forgive the king. The kingdom's end is near. This decay is a warning. The people too will soon rot." Yet these rumors stirred not only fear, but also a strange kind of hope. For the king's curse meant the throne was weakening. Oppressed peasants, merchants crushed by heavy taxes, and the poor who had long lived in the shadows of the palace began to see his decay as the possible dawn of their own freedom. Inside the palace, however, an entirely different storm raged. The nobles began exploiting the king's weakness for their own ambitions. As the disease advanced, his authority dwindled. Orders were questioned, sometimes ignored altogether. A vacuum of power opened the door to intrigue. Some forged secret alliances to support heirs to the throne, while others plotted to secure their fortunes once the king inevitably died. The king's illness also amplified the influence of religious authorities. Clergymen declared his rotting body to be a divine message, urging the people to repent and turn toward God. Some priests preached openly about the king's sins, accusing him of living in debauchery and claiming that his disease was proof of divine rejection. In the eyes of the masses, the king's sacred image was shattered. The royal physicians, meanwhile, struggled desperately. Every treatment only worsened the disease. Bloodletting drained his strength. Herbal baths caused the wounds to spread. Even foreign healers, summoned from distant lands, could not stop the rot. Each failure gave birth to new rumors among the people. This is no human illness, it is divine. His soul is already dead, and his body is merely following. The king's spirit deteriorated alongside his body. Once he had hidden his affliction with pride. But as the stench of decay spread throughout the palace, there was nothing left to conceal. Seeing the disgust in others' eyes shattered his pride. Writhing in his bed, he would erupt into fits of rage, screaming at his servants, only to break down moments later in tears, begging God for mercy. To those who witnessed him, he was no longer a sovereign chosen by heaven, but a wretched man abandoned by it. One night, even his most loyal attendants could endure no more. Some fainted upon entering his chambers, others fell ill for days after inhaling the reek of rotting flesh. In the palace corridors, a grim phrase began to circulate in hushed voices. "The king is no longer alive, he is the living dead." This idea upended the entire balance of the realm, for a living corpse sat upon the throne, occupying it yet incapable of ruling. Tension between the people, the church, and the nobility grew into an open struggle for power. Everyone waited for the king's death, and yet, bitterly, he did not die. He simply rotted. Thus, his affliction became more than a disease. It became a catastrophe that corroded the very soul of the kingdom. To the people, the king's living decay was proof of divine wrath. To the palace, it was the perfect opening for schemes and betrayal, and at the center of the storm, trapped in agony, was the king himself, utterly alone. As the king's illness advanced, it could no longer be hidden. Behind the heavy doors of the palace, the courtiers tried to mask the truth with incense, perfumed oils, and grand festivities. But the stench and the whispers pierced through the walls. Anyone who entered the king's chambers was met with an unbearable odor, not only of rotting flesh, but of a kingdom's power slowly collapsing. The physicians, despite all efforts, achieved nothing. Medicine at the time was primitive, its knowledge limited. No one knew of microbes or bacteria festering in his wounds. Instead, they resorted to bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayer rituals, and mercury mixtures. But far from helping, each treatment only worsened his condition. Bloodletting left him weak and pale. Herbs brought side effects and new pains, and every passing day more pieces of flesh fell away as his body continued to rot from within. Those closest to him lived in both fear and disgust. Servants covered their noses as they performed their duties. Some fled the chamber, unable to endure the sight, while others were haunted for days by nightmares of what they had witnessed. A phrase circulated in whispers within the palace. The king belongs to the realm of the dead, yet God refuses to take his soul. Soon these words spread among the people as well. In their eyes, the rotting monarch had become a living corpse. To the common folk, this was more than an illness. It was a message from the heavens. In that age, nothing was considered accidental. Every occurrence in nature was believed to be a sign from God or the devil. If the king's flesh was rotting, it could only be because of his sins. In the marketplaces and village squares, voices declared, "The king lived in debauchery, he stole from the poor, and God has turned his back on him." Some saw his decay as a warning that not only the king, but the people and the kingdom itself would soon crumble. These rumors became a grave threat to the palace. For if the sacred aura of kingship collapsed in the eyes of the people, so too did the authority of the throne. The nobility grew anxious. Some sought desperately to hide the king's condition, while others seized the chance to prepare for the future. Secret gatherings buzzed with one question: who would inherit the throne once it fell vacant? Some factions began backing rival princes, while others schemed to secure their own advantage. The king still lived, but his power slipped from his grasp. The church, meanwhile, rose as the greatest authority in the void. Archbishops entered the king's chamber to pray, to anoint his body with holy oils, to bathe him in sacred waters. Yet nothing changed. The rot persisted, sometimes seeming to spread even faster. To the people, this proved that the king's sins were beyond forgiveness. Even the clergy themselves became divided. Some insisted he was still God's chosen servant, while others declared he was forsaken, cursed. These debates reached the king's ears, and his mind darkened along with his body. Sleep deserted him, and his nights were plagued by nightmares. He woke to the stench of his own flesh, swearing he saw ghosts in his chamber. He began to hear the whispers of servants as plots of treason, and the helplessness of his physicians as deliberate sabotage. Paranoia consumed him. He punished some doctors, exiled servants, and drove away many who once stood by him. Fewer and fewer remained at his side. The man who had once marched proudly at the head of armies now sat alone in a darkened room, trapped with his decaying body. Within the palace walls, fear and betrayal coexisted. To the nobles, the king was no longer a leader, but an obstacle. His existence no longer upheld the kingdom, it poisoned it. Some even whispered of plans to hasten his death. But the king did not die. That was the most horrifying part. Death never came, and the rot never ceased. His condition infected not only his body, but the kingdom itself. The people turned desperately to God. The nobles spun their intrigues for the throne. The church reached for greater authority. Yet at the center of it all, upon the highest seat of power, sat one man, writhing in agony, falling apart, day by day, transformed into a living corpse. As the king's body continued to decay, a wave of unrest spread across every corner of the kingdom. The truth hidden behind the gilded walls of the palace could no longer be contained. Merchants entering the city, servants working in the royal kitchens, soldiers whispering in the barracks, all carried the same tale. The king's flesh was rotting, and his corruption was no longer confined to his body, but was pulling the entire realm down with it. The palace halls grew heavy with smoke. Incense burned in every chamber, thick clouds filling the corridors until eyes watered and throats stung. Heavy oils were poured into golden lamps, and wine-soaked tinctures were scattered across the floors in a desperate attempt to mask the stench. But the odor of decaying flesh could not be hidden. Blended with incense, it only grew sharper, sourer, more unbearable. When nobles came to pay their respects, they lowered their heads, held their breath, and averted their eyes. Upon the throne sat not the mighty ruler they once revered, but a ghostly figure, eyes glazed, skin mottled with purple, wounds dripping with pus. To the common people, the meaning was clear. God had abandoned the king. In villages, peasants knelt at church doors, whispering in their prayers, "We are sinners, our king is a sinner, but forgive us, Lord." Some saw his disease as a punishment for the misery they endured. He sinned, we starved. His rot is our deliverance, they said. Such words, passed from mouth to mouth, eroded the throne's sanctity more than any sword could. The church seized this moment to tighten its grip. Priests thundered from pulpits about the king's sins, declaring his suffering as proof of divine wrath, a lesson to all. Their sermons inflamed the people against the crown and sowed division among the nobility. A handful of lords still clung to the king's side, but most merely waited for his end, knowing the throne itself would rot if he remained. Meanwhile, the king's mind unraveled. Once sharp, cunning, and feared, his thoughts now drowned in pain and nightmares. At night he swore he heard whispers seeping from the walls. He accused his servants of spying, his physicians of betrayal. He claimed to see worms crawling from his wounds whenever he closed his eyes. In desperation, he muttered prayers for forgiveness, then erupted into curses, damning all who stood near him. Fear ruled the palace. Servants no longer dared to enter his chambers. They passed duties to one another like curses. Physicians abandoned hope of healing, attending only to dull his agony, though nothing dulled the truth. His body was collapsing from within. In time, he was left utterly alone. Friends withdrew, family plotted for succession, and courtiers vanished into the shadows. For a king, this solitude was worse than death. The true power of monarchy lay not in gold or armies, but in loyalty and awe. He had lost both. Now only silence remained, silence heavy with a mingled sense of incense and decay. Yet even death refused to come swiftly. Days stretched into weeks. His body had already surrendered, but his soul clung on as if heaven itself withheld release until every sin was repaid in torment. Each groan, each sleepless night was seen by the people as a tally in the ledger of divine justice. In the palace, whispers turned to anxious debates. When he dies, who will inherit the throne? Can the heir command loyalty, or will the kingdom fracture? No one had answers. What all knew was this: the once mighty king was no longer remembered for his triumphs, but for the stench of his ruin. Thus, beneath the shadow of a rotting body, the fate of an entire kingdom was being rewritten. The king's final days were like the darkest passages of a nightmare. His chamber doors were rarely opened now, and only a handful of servants dared to step inside. They wrapped thick cloths around their faces, carrying small vials of pungent oils to guard themselves from the stench. When the door creaked open, the odor that rushed out was so foul it made even the guards in the corridor retch. His once magnificent bed was soaked with blood, pus, and rotting flesh. The silken sheets that had once symbolized splendor were stained a filthy brown, and the royal chamber had become less a place of majesty than a tomb. Each breath he drew came with a muffled groan, sometimes followed by coughing fits that sprayed blood and foul matter from his lungs. The physicians, helpless, forced bitter syrups down his throat, but every swallow seemed only to worsen his suffering. His eyes no longer carried the spark of command or ambition. They reflected only fear, agony, and endless regret. At night his torment deepened. Flies swarmed his wounds, and maggots gnawed at his living flesh. When the servants tried to clean them away, he screamed in anguish, his cries echoing through the stone walls of the palace. The soldiers passing in the corridors muttered, "This place has become hell itself." Beyond the palace gates, the tales grew wilder. Some said the king had bargained with the devil and was now paying the price. Others believed God himself had cast down a special punishment. In village squares, old women frightened children with warnings, "Sin, and God will let your flesh rot like the king's." Thus, he became a living parable of damnation, an object lesson carved in pain. At last the king lost even the strength to speak. His eyes stared blankly into the shadows, his lips whispering silent prayers, his breath growing heavier with each hour. Priests came to anoint his body with sacred oils, but when their fingers touched his skin, they felt the flesh slip and melt beneath them. Even the most devout among them recoiled in horror. Later, one would write, "I beheld God's wrath with my own eyes. A king's body returned to the earth while he yet lived. His death dragged on far longer than anyone expected. For days the court held its breath, certain each hour would be his last. Yet his soul clung stubbornly to its ruined vessel, as though unwilling to depart until every measure of torment had been fulfilled. In those final moments, tears streamed down his face. Some whispered they were tears of repentance. Others claimed they were born of terror. But whatever their cause, they revealed one undeniable truth. For all his power, the king was but a mortal. At last, one midnight, the palace fell silent. The dreadful cries that had shaken its walls were stilled forever. The king exhaled his final breath, his decayed body collapsing into stillness. Yet the sight he left behind was too terrible to forget. Much of his flesh had dissolved, exposing bone. When attendants tried to lift him, his body nearly disintegrated in their hands. They rushed to seal him into a coffin, though few were willing to carry it. The stench was unbearable, as though death itself clung to the wood. His burial was no grand affair. It was hurried, shrouded in shame and fear. Few dared approach his grave, and some even hurled stones, crying out, "May God's wrath follow you." His death was not remembered as the passing of a monarch, but as a symbol of divine judgment, the fall of a man cursed by heaven. But the story did not end there. With his passing, the kingdom itself began to rot. The nobles, freed from his shadow, fell into vicious disputes over succession. The realm splintered, weakened from within, just as his body had. To the people, the royal family was no longer a sacred bloodline, but a house damned by God. The king's fate became not just a personal tragedy, but the omen of an empire's slow collapse. And for centuries his tale was retold in hushed voices. There was once a king who rotted alive, for God turned his face from him, and with him a kingdom perished. After the king's death, the palace did not fall into silence. On the contrary, chaos and uncertainty spread through every corner. His death, long awaited as a release, had instead unleashed years of suppressed fears. The throne now stood empty, and with it came one of the most dangerous truths of the Middle Ages. A power vacuum never lasted long. Inside the palace, rival factions moved swiftly. The king's brothers, nephews, and distant kin all gathered in secret chambers, each staking their claim to the crown. Some argued that the king's child was far too young to rule. Others insisted that a cursed bloodline must not continue, and called for the complete eradication of the royal house. Every whispered debate sowed the seeds of a new civil war. In this turmoil, the church emerged as the most powerful actor. Priests and bishops seized the moment, shaping public opinion with their sermons. To them, the king's decay was no mere disease, but a divine warning. Only a ruler who walks the righteous path can lead his people to prosperity. These words weighed heavily on the nobles vying for the throne, for the people now interpreted every move in the palace through the lens of divine judgment. Beyond the palace walls, a different tension simmered. Though many peasants had rejoiced at the king's death, their joy quickly turned to dread. Farmers feared higher taxes, merchants worried that civil war would close the trade routes, and in taverns and marketplaces the same question echoed: what happens now? No one could answer. The king's burial itself became a scandal. He had been laid in the ground hastily, without the grandeur his station demanded. Even among the nobility, this caused unrest. Some said, whatever his sins, he was still a king, he deserved an honorable funeral. Others countered, no splendor belongs to a cursed body. Thus, even in death, his memory was restless. To the common people, he was no longer their sovereign, only the rotting king. Over time, his story passed into legend. In village squares, tales grew of the stench from his chamber, likened to the opening of hell's gates. Mothers warned their children, lie, and you will rot like the king. In some regions, peasants swore that strange lights flickered above his grave at night. Priests called these visions divine warnings, urging the faithful to repent. His decay became not only a personal tragedy, but a parable burned into the religious memory of an entire people. On the political stage, however, matters were far from simple. The power struggle that followed his death plunged the realm into turmoil. Noble alliances crumbled as quickly as they were formed, each lord chasing his own advantage. The church, ever watchful, gathered more authority, blessing some claimants while condemning others, holding the balance of power in its hands. Yet behind all these struggles lingered the haunting image of the king himself, his screams, the suffocating incense that could not mask his stench, and the hollow eyes of a man consumed alive. His fate became a mirror of the realm's fragility, for just as his body had decayed from within, so too had the empire begun to rot at its very core. And as years turned to centuries, chroniclers debated the truth of his end. Some sought medical explanations, others clung to the certainty of divine punishment. But whatever scholars wrote, in the hearts of the people, his name remained unchanged. The king, abandoned by God, the king who rotted alive. The years following the king's death were nothing short of a lingering nightmare for the kingdom. The name of the rotting king cast a shadow far darker than the empty throne itself. The once resplendent halls of the palace no longer echoed with music or feasts, but with whispers, secret meetings, and tense debates. Everyone argued over who should ascend the throne, yet no one could dispel the fear rooted deep in the hearts of the people. They no longer wanted just a new ruler. They longed for a sovereign untainted by what they saw as God's curse. But the shadow of that curse stretched even over the heirs. The king's children and brothers were met with suspicion. They share his blood, so they must share his doom, murmured peasants in taverns and fields. Many believed that no descendant of that line could ever save the realm. This poisoned the struggle for succession. Some nobles demanded the royal line be extinguished altogether, clearing the way for a new dynasty, while others insisted legitimacy could only come from the same blood. Thus, the kingdom was torn in two. The church seized upon this division as an opportunity. Priests turned the king's decay into a powerful allegory. From pulpits across the land, they declared that God had punished a sinful monarch, offering his corruption as a lesson to all. Yet these sermons were more than religious warnings. They were political weapons. For the people believed that whoever received the church's blessing was truly God's chosen. In this way, the clergy's influence over the crown grew greater than ever. Among the common folk, the king's story transformed into folklore. Around village fires, tales told of his ghost wandering the palace corridors at night, flesh still rotting, eyes glowing with torment. In some versions, worms from his corpse poisoned the soil, leaving the earth barren around his grave. Such legends painted him not merely as cursed, but as something monstrous. Over time, even his name was lost to memory. He became known only by a grim title, the Rotting King. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by warning, "Behave, or the Rotting King will come for you." Thus, even in death, he lived on as an instrument of fear, haunting daily life. Meanwhile, intrigue consumed the court. Rival branches of the royal family plotted against each other. Secret assassinations were attempted, and letters carried whispers of treachery across castles under cover of night. This ceaseless strife weakened the realm, leaving its borders vulnerable. Neighboring powers circled like wolves, ready to exploit the kingdom's decay. The king's body had rotted away long ago, but the rot he left behind continued to eat through the strength, honor, and security of his nation. And still, in the minds of the people, one image endured, the king writhing in agony behind the cold stone walls of his chamber, his flesh falling away, his stench suffocating all who drew near. His screams were passed down from one generation to the next. Centuries later, chroniclers would write of that age, not with the medical diagnoses, but with the horrific legends that had outlived the man, for it was not his death that mattered, but his decay. Thus, the tale of the Rotting King became more than the tragedy of a single monarch. It became the emblem of a kingdom's decline. He continued to rot not only on his throne, but in the hearts and memories of his people. His legacy endured as one of history's most haunting warnings, a symbol of how power, faith, and flesh alike can waste away under the weight of corruption and curse.